I'm Jim Latham, work for Natural Resources Wales, now as their Senior Specialist Officer for Nature Networks. Just to find that it won't move on. There we are. So I'll give the first half of this presentation. So this is like a sort of structure for my bit of it. I'm going to give some background and the sort of ecological basis for the work we're doing, and then introduce the Nature Networks programme as a funded scheme. Then talk a little bit about prioritising actions and the mapping we're doing to facilitate that. And then finally talk about some of the future development work, future research and development, which we need to do to properly implement all this. So in terms of context, as we're all aware, we're in the middle of a global nature emergency, and the text on here is just sort of the example of the kinds of facts and figures that are going around to illustrate the perilous state of biodiversity globally. Nature Networks is seen as a response to that emergency, in part, based around protected sites, which are a fundamental mechanism for biodiversity protection and recovery globally. But there are issues with that, because the features of sites are often not in good condition. They're subject to all manner of pressures and threats and issues. For example, pollution, invasive non-native species, overgrazing, all these sort of things that are getting mean the features are not as they should be. But also there's a landscape ecology dimension that sites are impacted by wider habitat loss and fragmentation. Sites are often perhaps too small to maintain their biodiversity indefinitely. They may be subject to edge effects, which also affects the site. And because they're isolated, it means species can't move around the landscape in a natural way. So Nature Networks is about addressing these issues in a coordinated way. So we're aiming to improve the condition of the featured sites, but also to build connectivity between the sites so they actually form resilient ecological networks. And just a note on terminology, resilient ecological network seems to be fairly well established as a term for linking up our sort of biodiversity hotspots, if you like, but we also tend to call them nature networks. These terms tend to be sort of interchangeable. To illustrate what that might mean, I've got a kind of graphic here. This is supposed to represent triple SIs in a landscape in poor condition. This is perhaps a sort of traditional way of seeing them as islands of biodiversity in the landscape. We want to move from that to something like this, which recognizes connections between them. So it's working with linear connections in some cases, say streams or hedgerows, stepping stones in the landscape, networks that occur by virtue of the permeability of the landscape, and mosaics of small patches of habitat in the landscapes, and using that to target habitat restoration and habitat creation to enhance the networks, to bolster the networks and consolidate them. Now, this sort of diagram has been around a while, and I think there was one popularized in the Latham review, which has sort of gone all over the place, and people have made their own versions. This is my own attempt at it to try and illustrate some of the features we're particularly interested in Wales. Now, presenting something like this, people often say, yeah, but what about the white bits? Are you just giving up on those? Well, the answer is no, we're not. I mean, we want to recognize the important areas for connectivity, but also in the context of the wider landscape, which needs a general level of better management to make things better connected and better condition. So moving on to the Nature Networks programme itself, so this is a terminology thing again. Nature Networks may be the outcome on the ground, but it's also the name of a programme. This is a 3-year Welsh Government programme running to 2025 with a budget of around 45 million in total. And there are 2 strands of funding in there. There are an internal NRW funding, which allows sort of better management of many of the triple SIs and other protected sites. It's also enabled NRW to bring in additional staff to actually administer the funding and actually get activities going. The second stream of funding goes to the National Lottery Heritage Fund, who are administering quite large grants to bring in big partnership projects with an additional emphasis on community engagement. And this year we will let something around £10 million on these sort of grants already. And there are wider links to other programs and policies, not least the Global Biodiversity Framework 30 by 30 target, which is an international commitment and well, expanded on in the box below there. But essentially it's around protecting and managing correctly at least 30% of land areas and sea areas globally. So this work sort of feeds into that as well. to develop nature networks or resilient ecological networks, you need to get the right actions in the right place. So a lot of the work is around doing that. Previously, we've done a lot of work on prioritizing sites and features and actions to make sure we're hitting the most important ones first. But we also need to guide actions and the locations of actions to build connectivity and resilience across landscapes to identify focus areas. Now, we've been doing this for a while anyway, but in 2022, Welsh Government ran a deep dive into biodiversity, specifically looking at the 30 by 30 targets and things that need to be done to deliver it. And an action arising from that was, as in quotes here, a nature networks map outlining key focus areas will be produced. So a map, well, it's obviously going to be more than a single map, and we're doing a lot of work now to really flesh that out and deliver it. So this is an overview of the map development. There are two stages to it. The stage one, which is delivering basically in a few weeks, is to make accessible a lot of information that we already have that is usable to people who may be applying for future lottery grants, for example, and our own staff internally, and whoever else wants to use them in terms of partners. So obviously information on sites, some generic buffers around them, and then work we've been doing on habitat networks and priority ecological networks, which I'll expand upon in a minute. And this will be delivered through various portals and other mechanisms to get it out there. Stage two, running from now through to 2025, is much wider development. So we'll be bringing in information on potential and opportunity and existing action areas in the landscape, and bringing all this together to identify clear focus areas that we may want to concentrate on. We need to bolster our mapping of networks for additional ecosystems, thinking particularly of freshwater marine as areas which need further attention. And all this then needs to be applied to planning 30 by 30. And then we need to build connections to other relevant initiatives and schemes. And a couple of things just to draw your attention to here is around dark skies. There's a lot of increasing awareness of the impact of light pollution on biodiversity. And also at the same time, dark sky areas are being mapped and being promoted. There's a great opportunity to join these things up within the network mapping. Beelines is another thing run by BugLife, which also identifies sort of key connectivity areas in the landscape. We want to make sure all these things really join up. And there are issues around evaluation and reporting and research and development. So to give you a flavour of some of the information that goes into this, there's a couple of things here about habitat network modelling. Now this is work which has been going on for 20 years now. It started off 20 years ago as a joint project between, as was the Countryside Council for Wales, Forest Research and Forestry Commission Wales and other partners to model habitat networks for woodlands in the landscape. And this used the Beetle toolkit at the time, which is essentially a least cost model, which takes into account assumptions on species dispersal and the costs of all the permeability of the landscape. So the outcome is easier to give you an example. This is a map of Wales showing fragments of woodland in dark green across it. The outcome of the model is something like that, where it generates buffers effectively around habitat patches, but intelligent buffers that take into account the relative permeability of the habitats between patches. So it changes the perspective. You can start to see which patches in the landscape are likely to be better connected than others. And this is an enormously important tool for planning action across landscapes. We've developed this work in-house with a tool provided by Forest Research, and we've mapped core, focal and local networks, which is our own innovation, for all Wales, for habitats including woodland, grassland, heathlands, fens, bogs and sand dunes. So it's a huge resource there. Making this applicable then to nature networks, we've developed these things called priority ecological networks, or PENs, which are a subset of these networks that that show connectivity between the protected sites themselves. So these are the areas we really want to focus on as a framework for action that can help build connectivity between our protected sites. And the example on the right there is a recent iteration for semi-natural grassland PEN, just developed this year, including a whole load of new information on recent grassland survey. So we have these PENs revised entirely in 2023 for a whole series of habitats, woodland, grassland, heathland, fens, bogs and sand dunes, and we have also ones in development for marine and something planned for fresh water as well. So we want to bring this all together and get this disseminated publicly very soon so that people can actually start to use these maps. There's very much an emphasis on these maps being descriptions out there. We're keen not for it to be seen as some prescription, things that must be done across the landscape. It's very much information on the likely connectivity between our best sites that people can use in the most appropriate way to develop projects. Moving on to stage 2, just to wrap this up fairly quickly now, to looking at some of the areas for future research and development, which will be carrying on in-house, but we're hoping also to have some budget in the coming year for some contracted work to expand on this. We need to look at the network mapping itself, bearing in mind that what we're using is 20 years old. We need to see what other new methodologies are out there and how we can link it to new land cover data, and also get to a situation where we can actually repeat this mapping to look at change over time. We want to start looking at climate change aspects. The network mapping we have is essentially climate blind. It looks at connectivity in all directions. We want to start to bring in climate change scenarios so that we can identify the key networks that will help biodiversity respond to climate change. We want to look at isolated sites, bearing in mind that some sites may simply be so isolated, it's really not possible to network them. Can we actually start to quantify that degree of isolation and bring in appropriate responses for the most isolated sites? And then finally, we want to work towards this bigger picture, how we start to integrate all this, how we bring together these core areas, these clusters of sites, the networks, all this restoration activity and potential in the right way and in a meaningful way, if you like, to really give a proper picture of what's going on and really focus action in the right areas. So that's pretty much it. I hope that was about 10 minutes or maybe a bit over. And I shall move on or let Liz take over her section, if you're all still there.
Fantastic, thanks, Jim.
I'll stop sharing mine then, and Liz, I hope, will be able to share hers.
Just got a bit of background noise there. I don't know if that's from...
Yeah, sorry, that's just my cat,
Okay.
who doesn't, in 3 years, hasn't learnt any webinar etiquette, unfortunately, and insists on... what I'm struggling with is, like, I can't press the share button. Let me just cancel that and try again. It's not coming up.
That's all right. We'll just double check that.
Ah, there we go. That's maybe why. That's because I can't select things. Sorry, I'm a bit out of practice with Zoom. So let me just present from here. Perfect. Okay, so hopefully you can see that and hear me.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak, and for Jim to extending the invitation. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes running through the application of nature networks in South Central, and giving a couple of examples and kind of how we've gone about it a little bit. So just a bit of background. So I work in operations in Natural Resources Wales. I'm in the area statement team, so developing and delivering the South Central area statement. So that's been published since 2020, very much a collaborative effort with partners in place, and the area statements are tasked with delivering the sustainable management of natural resources by identifying priorities, risks and opportunities for that in place. So there's quite a lot to that, quite a lot of different ways to deliver SM&R as well. So in South Central, we get to really focus in on what makes South Central special. It's the smallest area statement, it's got the most people, and it's also got a number of internationally important sites, protected sites, and also nationally as well. and also has 2 designated landscapes in the part of the Brecon Beacons National Park and the Glamorgan Heritage Coast. So a really wide range of important habitats, species, and then also really closely alongside a lot of the population in South Wales. So what I've been doing as part of my work on the Building Resilient Ecosystems theme in the South Central Area Statement is looking at the Practitioner's Guide to Resilient Ecological Networks. So this has been out for a few years now. It very much builds on the English guidance, but in a Welsh context. As Jim has said, there's many policy and kind of practical drivers for us to think about ecological networks and nature networks. They're mentioned in a number of different policies, and this 3-step process really kind of just sets out what needs to be done and how to start to approach that. I've taken this at a regional scale, which is maybe slightly different to how the guidance was maybe thought of when it was published. So there are definitely some learnings as well from doing that in place. So in South Central, it's really important that we understood the evidence before getting into nature networks, and perhaps in South Central it's a slightly overlooked area for ecosystems and ecosystem resilience, partly because of that large urban element and large population, but it's also got some really, as I say, really special places, really important, definitely valued, and definitely contributing to our natural resources in Wales and the provision of ecosystem services and benefits. So what we did soon after the area statement was released in 2020, we progressed understanding more about the evidence base by working through the ecosystem profiles. So taking each ecosystem as a cut within South Central and really highlighting, whether it's the SAC that we have for sand dunes and associated habitats down in the southwest of place, or whether it's the beach woodlands in North Cardiff, and everything else in between. And we did a narrative assessment of ecosystem resilience, so looking at diversity, extent, condition and connectivity, to really highlight those risks and those opportunities for those ecosystems going forward. What we then have to do is almost recut place, if you like, into the nature networks, and this is a version of some of the mapping that Jim's just been showing, and this is starting to give you a bit of an idea that where might we want to focus our attentions, where do some of these networks correlate with activity that's either already happening or conversations that are already happening, partnership landscape work that might already be underway, national programs such as Sands for Life, and what might we be able to do to progress. I'd like to see an equal coverage of activity for our networks across all of place, because I think that's really important for nature recovery. So I just wanted to bring you a couple of examples and kind of how we're going through those 3 steps of gathering the evidence base, bringing people together, mapping and visioning, and then also action planning, and hopefully very much delivering from that as well. So I think it's really important to say that all of this work builds on everything that's gone before. It doesn't override, it doesn't replace anything that's gone on. It's a different way of looking, I think, at very well-known conservation methods and management actions, and it's maybe framing it in a more relevant policy and an updated understanding that we have now, and what we need to do to move towards nature recovery in Wales. So in North Cardiff, and it is a cross-boundary nature network, it does go into Caerphilly along the ridge, but for the purposes of South Central, we're working very much within the Cardiff local authority area, and that was a partnership that was very much started by the Cardiff Council and the Local Nature Partnership, the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales, and also Natural Resources Wales. So really key landowners, land managers in this area coming together to talk about some of the pressures on this landscape and the woodland features, some absolutely incredible beech woodland. Trying to illustrate best I can with a photograph from one of my many walks in the area. Amazing beech woodland, and also under a huge amount of recreational pressure. So by coming together and talking about what we'd like to see happen, and then by also engaging with the local users as well of the woodlands, we've started to get an idea as a partnership about what could happen and what needs to happen to restore the woodlands and make sure that they're still there in 100 years' time. And when we start to look at some layers for this, we get to, unfortunately, badly colour-coded maps. I do apologise if anybody's colour-blind. It's not the best colour sense, and we will be changing it. But we start to bring to life some of the diagrams that Jim was showing earlier, in terms of how those special areas of conservation and those triple SIs and protected sites are really the core zones of these nature networks. And then we look beyond them to the sites of importance for nature conservation, and then beyond again to things like buffers and corridors and new patches to create the nature recovery zone. This is by no means a finalised map. This is just something we were, as we work through the data and the modelling that's been produced, we need to apply that in a local context with local knowledge. So this is really helping us, it helps to almost stratify some of that action planning really around our understanding of what does need to happen, what could happen. Some of these areas are Welsh Government woodland estate forestry, some of them will be private land or public body owned land. So there's different opportunities depending on the land management and the levers and the schemes available to be able to influence management. You know, most of this does come down to either statutory obligation in terms of protected site management, or will in terms of wider landscape management, and then that's going to be really important going forward for nature networks and how we communicate and work with landowners. So this is at a stage where thinking about how to get extra funding and start to build on all that work, having increased awareness with the recreational users, starting to think about how to get these protected sites on the road to recovery and contributing to those 30 by 30 targets. Another example, much earlier in a developmental stage of a nature network, is the Vale of Glamorgan Coast. We managed to secure some coastal community capacity building funding earlier in the year, and that's been used to again start to collate the evidence base, identify the evidence gaps for the coastal area, to look at those key players, key stakeholders, have a very initial discussion, mostly amongst kind of public bodies and the NGO sector, but aware that we also need to talk further with communities and landowners and businesses as well in this area, and start to look again at some of those opportunities through mapping, through discussion, hearing a lot about people's lived experience of nature loss in this area, looking at people's what they'd like to see the coast, how they'd like to see it in the future, starting to consider some of those coastal adaptations that might be required, especially with climate change, and start to pull together hopefully another application for funding maybe later this year through that coastal capacity coastal community capacity building fund. So I think that's been a really interesting piece of work to do at speed, but it does show that the 3 steps are also iterative, in that you can bring people along at each stage. Maybe something positive happens, positive action happens, and that draws more people into the partnership. Doing things in partnership is really important. Obviously, as Natural Resources Wales, we can provide a lot of data and the place-based knowledge, that we've gathered through the area statement evidence base, but it can't be done to these local areas or within the networks. It does need to be done very much together in partnership, with everybody pulling towards a shared vision. And this is where we are with this coastal nature network, as I say, so very much looking at what we could do realistically this year, and that's really the key with all of these nature networks. We've got 16 in place, and some of them are very far ahead, fully delivered. They might not even known they were a nature network, because they were just working at a landscape scale. For example, the Gwent Levels under a landscape heritage fund. But perhaps others, maybe we need to help convene the space for those conversations, and perhaps kind of add some project development support in there, so that, as I say, eventually I'd really like to see a consistent effort across all of place for nature networks. And nature networks fit into that bigger picture of building resilient ecosystems, building resilience through supporting the diversity of species and habitats, the extent, the condition, especially of protected sites, but also wider sites as well. And then also that connectivity and bringing in that these sites will not function and provide what they need to provide as islands, but they very much need to be joined together. And I'd really like some of these charts and graphs to start going in the other direction, so that we're heading towards favourable management, favourable condition, species recovery, and also wider nature recovery. And that will it will make a real difference. As I say, we might not have a large area of designated landscape in South Central, but we've got a lot of people who need to connect with nature for their health and well-being. We need to maintain those benefits that we gather from nature for our own health and well-being, and a vibrant and resilient ecosystems is really the best way to do that. So that's what we're working towards. If anybody wants to talk to me further about any of that, I would be more than happy to discuss, either at a local level or for the whole of South Central at a regional level. But yeah, that's us from South Central, and thank you again for having us this afternoon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you again, Jim. It's been really great to see your work and how you're putting ecological networks into practice, particularly like the examples of how you're involving the community and other stakeholders. So that's great. I'm just keeping an eye on time. It'd be great to have a few questions now. So please feel free